me go ahead and start. Ooh, you have a nice share.
Well, this is the framework that I've been talking about for like the last month, the one from John Meadows.
Oh, okay. I've not seen it.
Yeah. So we have yours, right? And then I've been talking about this one from him that he goes from end to end, right? Like he goes from end to end, and he talks about the source and from the accounts on the GitHub site, build infrastructure, goes into just the Docker Hub and whatever vendor stuff going on, right? So there's a third party piece to this. Then he talks about the ingestion process on into binary repositories, developer workstation, into the build infrastructure. Like he goes all the way clear across, and then where I'm looking at is saying, if you start over at source code and the GitHub portion, and you lay S2C2F over that, and you slide over, get over past the ingestion process, past the binary repository process, and then you lay SLSA over that and go off into the towards the end. That's what we're looking at. I mean, in the nutshell, right? There might even be some overlay, some crossover. Like if you look at I want to say a Venn diagram, if I remember, that's how you call it.
Yeah. So this is neat. I think this would be good for like a drill down, because it might be overwhelming to a user at first glance. So
No, we'd have to simplify this.
Yeah.
We absolutely would have to simplify this.
So
this is a lot.
I think this is like a story, right? The whole story, and we need to chunk it up into smaller stories to get to this point.
That's why I mentioned your diagram, because your diagram is a little bit more, is a little neater.
Yeah, so let me show. I did update it, and then I have a couple of things. Like, it's kind of similar. It's not the same, but it shows like pipelines and attestations and things like that. So this is the original. I was kind of looking at it and thinking, okay, well, this is salsa build when you think of like a PR pipeline, right? The cryptographic signatures, right? You would do that during the build. Any pipeline metadata, publishing, but I didn't really see anything else that was build. The rest was more of source, right? So if we think of salsa source and what we could potentially imagine, and then there's that salsa common security requirements that aren't really fleshed out, and I feel like those are the things in purple. I thought maybe deploy to production might be Fresca, but I don't remember if Fresca handles like validation of the package before it gets deployed.
Well, the salsa security requirements, once again, that is out of scope for salsa. I don't know how when I saw the build track versus the source track, I said, okay, I see what's happening. I kind of like it too, because it keeps the scope intact, right? There's no scope creep. You start talking about vulnerability management. That's a bit of a that's a bit of scope creep. Now you're asking something like Salsa, you're asking Salsa now to sit there and have security scanning portion. But you're asking Salsa to do too much with that. Do too much with that. That should be conducted a little earlier on, right?
And it is. It is. It's just more of, if somebody, I think the intent, if I'm not mistaken, I think the intent is if you
But
remove these,
if you're saying tracking remediation,
what,
so
what, what,
tracking
what?
vulnerability remediation, I mean, that's a portion of vulnerability management, but that's not vulnerability management in its total.
It's not. But if you remove all of these purple parts, as an example, what you get is something that's SLSA compliant, but may not be secure. Because
Well, so
nobody's
so
doing,
that so that's the rub, right? So
yeah.
that's the rub. The rub here is if you as it looks right now, it's a set of compliance requirements,
Mm-hmm,
not a security framework. Even in its current state, even in its version 1,
mm-hmm,
it's a compliance requirement and not a security framework. For example, what we talked to them today about the specification not being completely clear, level 1 versus level 2, and the language being used. I mean, it lends itself to being a compliance requirement. Have something in place.
mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter. Have something in place. A security framework's a little different. The security framework is like, I have something in place. Have this in place,
Correct.
and use this tool to create this thing to provide this level of control.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that would be a security framework, which even in version 1 of SLSA, it doesn't do that. The S2C2F, however, that's all it does is provide those type of security controls. It's a security framework.
Does it have,
It's not a compliant.
does it have these? Sorry to
It
interrupt.
has scanning, vulnerability management.
Okay.
It has all of that stuff in it.
Okay,
Now the
so then,
compliance checks and all that kind of stuff, that's very SLSA specific and very SLSA centric. But when it comes to security controls, and like I said, that's why it's very consumer focused and consumer based, right? Providing those security controls to help provide the security controls necessary for ingestion. So how are you scanning packages as they come in? First of all, how are you ingesting? What type of, are you mirroring repositories? Are you scanning? Are you, I mean, like just to pull up I need to pull up the framework here just to go through that real quick.
yeah.
So,
So are you,
just before you make that color adjustment, I mean, like S2C2F doesn't say anything about the publish workflow. So security
No.
advisors in publish doesn't make sense to be that color. It doesn't say anything about vulnerability management left to right through the SDLC. It says vulnerability management. It makes specifications and requirements around your dependencies. So at the highest level, I would propose that, like, if you think about a software build, I'm a software producer and I'm sitting right in the middle of your diagram and I'm doing a build. And what are the materials for my build? The materials for my build are source, my first party source, which I wrote and I own, and then the dependencies that I imported. And if you think about SLSA has a set of requirements around how source is managed and how build is done. It doesn't say anything about dependencies. And S2C2F speaks only about dependencies. And so actually, like, that there's one world in which these things work super well together, because if you look at producing software, I have a build, which takes my source and my dependencies and produces an artifact. Now, SLSA talks about what the build should look like, and it talks about what your source management practices should look like. It doesn't say anything about dependency management. S2C2F specifies dependency management and doesn't say anything about the build or about your source. And so,
Right.
In terms of how they fit, like, at the highest level, like I don't have a diagram like this. I'm definitely like kind of crayons on the wall level, but like it seems to me that actually S2C2F, you could imagine an Uber security framework where you say, okay, there's a set of practices you need for your builder. SLSA's got a good stab at that. There's a set of practices you need for source management. SLSA has a reasonable stab at that, or it's not very fleshed out. There's a set of practices you need for dependency management. S2C2F does a great job of laying that out. And so looking at the major components of a software factory you got build, you got source, you got dependencies. And between SLSA and S2C2F, it seems to me that we've covered 3 core areas of the software factory: build, source, and dependencies, without any overlap. And so actually, I could imagine, saying SLSA, forget that, like, we could think of a new name for SLSA if we don't like the name SLSA, or don't like, wanting to kind of, acquire another. But like, imagine an Uber framework which says, here's what's important for build, and here's the requirements and practices there. Here's what's important for dependency management, requirements and practices there. Same for source, same for vulnerability management, and putting these under a single umbrella that the OpenSSF owns, and says, here's our overall supply chain framework. S2C2F is where we begin when we start to think about dependencies. SLSA is where we begin when we start to think about build. Vulnerability management, we don't have anything left to right at the moment. And so it seems to me that the pieces come together that way. And that's why I feel like, SLSA and S2C2F, talk to different but key parts of the supply chain, thinking about build, taking the upstream materials being source and dependencies. And between SLSA and S2C2F, we've got that covered. Does that make sense to you too?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I'm actually trying to pull up here so that we can look at the different levels. We could look at the different levels and because you're absolutely right, Isaac. SLSA does pick up where S2C2F ends. It should pick it up, and any gaps that there are ahead of that is what we can work on in these respective SIGs to close these gaps, or identify whether or not these Fresca or Guac or the maturity. And I know that the supply chain maturity model worked in the CDF. That's for artifact life cycle stuff after the fact. So I know where that sits. But what would fill these gaps in the middle? Let me pull up here these
And while you're pulling that up, just to continue my thought, I mean, given that SLSA has some traction with respect to adoption, it could well be that adding S2C2S style levels to SLSA around, hey, here's how you do dependency management, actually helps get that adopted, because SLSA already has some adoption. It already has people moving up the SLSA level. Already has both in open source and commercial people thinking about SLSA, implementing SLSA, and adding requirements around dependency management to SLSA could be a great way to push that adoption, in the sense that it's much easier to add features to users than it is to add users to features, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So two things. One is SLSA does talk about dependencies, and at one point they do talk about transitive dependencies in their source. I think it's the provenance section. So they touch on it, but I don't think they've given it enough detail.
There's no requirements about the management of dependencies. And for instance, one of the criticisms of SLSA is, I could produce a SLSA level 4 artifact today, which has SLSA level 0 dependencies. And there are people who are saying, well, what sense does that make? How do I reason about a level? And so I think that's a fair criticism of SLSA. And so I think the potential for O2C2F to come in and say, well, gosh, we've got a super well-reasoned, well thought out, fleshed out, framework for how you do OSS dependency management. That does fill a critical gap in our overall story.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to make a comment on before we start on this is, so for the common requirements, common security requirements, a lot of them are coming from the SSDF, right? So like vulnerability management and making sure you're scanning, etc. I wouldn't say that SLSA necessarily it's in scope of SLSA, but I feel like SLSA, as with any other framework, should have something that says you should be doing this and you should provide attestation that you are doing this, right? Not necessarily a whole vulnerability management program, but it's more of, are you actually scanning, remediating, and doing it all over again, right? But it is part of the SSDF, which is why I call it out, because a lot of times people think, oh, well, you know, once we're done, we're done, right? There's no more scanning.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's a good point. And I think that the other thing which is interesting, just as we think about, you know, differences and similarities of S2C2F, is that S2C2F seems to speak more to organizational practices. SLSA, a level, applies to an artifact. A given artifact has been built at a SLSA level, whereas S2C2F speaks to, you know, organizational practices, which may then, you know, transitively apply to any number of artifacts. And it could be that a given organization is level 4 in this one area, level 2 in this other area, and so on.
Yes.
But the practices are anchored on an organization rather than an artifact, whereas the practices for SLSA, in fact, the level and the attestation is at the artifact level rather than the organization level. So I think that that's something which, again, like, I'm not suggesting we make any changes apart from just kind of be cognizant of it. And as we're talking about the two, point to that as you know, a distinction of the way people should think about it differently.
Well, and I think that's where you differentiate, you know, between the security framework that is the S2C2F versus the compliance nature of SLSA. If you're going straight on artifacts and you're attesting to the fact that something's been done per the artifact that's been generated, right? And whether or not you can validate that artifact. Where S2C2F, like you said, organizationally, are we doing these practices? Are these things being done? Just so happens that the S2C2F is structured in the way where it's a maturity model. So how mature is your organization against some of the practices in the S2C2F? And then, of course, on the back end, where if there are artifacts generated, those can be pulled in to say, hey, these artifacts support these claims made under SLSA, right? So you can clearly see where one hand washes the other here.
Right,
And
right. And I think, I mean, the other thing about SLSA that makes it interestingly different, or I don't know how you all thought about this for S2C2F, is, you know, SLSA has the ability for tools to make, you know, cryptographically, you know, unreputable, like, kind of claims about the thing. And so if you say, I trust a tool called GitHub Actions, GitHub Actions can say, I built this thing and it's SLSA level 3 and I signed that. And so there's an end-to-end kind of cryptographic assertion that you can make through the supply chain that's anchored in the trust you have in a tool.
Yeah.
And with S2C2F, I think you're always going to be essentially trusting an organization which makes an attestation about it rather than a tool, if that makes sense.
Right.
So Jay,
but it could be that there's a chance to develop tools to do, you know, S2C2F type audits. I mean, I don't know if you've thought about this, Jay, of how that would look, but it would be neat to explore that space.
So the great thing about this, what I put up here right now is just levels, and I put the levels there. I'll come back to that part in a second. But and of course there's different practices, about 8 different practices under the framework. But you mentioned it here, right? So these are just the common threats, and I'm trying to come down here. I think there's a tools area here where we talk about respective tools as well. I'm gonna find that area. Because that's something that we did talk about. Who's gonna, and then of course the question was, who's gonna create these tools?
It did say audit it. I saw a section that said audit it. So it's almost like telling you how you're going to check it.
Right. So that's this part right here.
Yeah.
I can prove that artifacts in production has full chain of custody from all this stuff, and that's so when we say audited, let's distinguish the difference between auditing that you have, that something was done, you have an artifact that says it was done and we can validate that, versus the fact that you have an artifact at all.
Okay.
Right. So that's the when I think about SLSA, I think about attestation. And where my vision, right, when I think about visioning, I think about not just being able to self-attest, that this has been done, but a third-party attestation. So eventually, being able to contract like I don't know, one of the big four companies come down and say, "Are you SLSA compliant?" And the way in which you met SLSA compliance, did you use the S2C2F to secure your environment, produce the artifacts necessary to be SLSA compliant?
I think yes, but I think when I think about certification of SLSA compliance, that applies to the builder, and so the certification can
Yes.
so there's a point of leverage which can be done, and that a certifying authority can come and say GitHub Actions can build at SLSA level 3, and so when you see assigned attestations from GitHub Actions that says SLSA level 3, you can trust that. Whereas I think certification and attestation in the S2C2F land isn't done at the tools level, it's done at the organizational practices
It's done
level.
at the organizational level, yes.
So you might have 1,000 organizations each needing an audit, whereas if those 1,000 organizations and they share the use of 4 build tools, in SLSA land you only need to do 4 certifications rather than 1,000.
Right.
And I think
whereas in S2C2F, you're going to need a plethora of tools, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's potential to have what parts of S2C2F can be automated by tools, which can then make those automated and cryptographically asserted attestations.
Yeah.
So I was trying to go through the levels, Jay. I actually took a screenshot and put it in this mural that I have to try to start capturing notes. Let me
stop sharing that. Oh, did you? Am I still sharing? Let me stop sharing.
No, yeah, I just took over.
Cool.
So these are the 4 levels, right? Use package managers, local copy of artifact, inventory, OSS, manual OSS updates. So this is about just in general your, I guess, first level dependencies, right?
Yeah.
This is the things that you need. This one, end of life, auto, almost, it's not quite vuln management, but because it's just about scanning, making sure that you have updating and cyber hygiene. Clone, this right here, this clone OSS source, I think that's this. Remember we were talking with Marcella and others, and we came up with this diagram of, well, how do you use, or how do you do OSS when you also have proprietary code? Do you just clone it directly from the repo, or do you have an internal mirror?
Yeah.
For active security reviews, provenance, validate SBOMs. Oh, does SLSA ever talk about SBOMs? I don't think they do.
So there is conversation in a few blog posts about SBOMs and SLSA, and it's more towards using SBOMs as one of the artifacts that are used for attestation and SLSA.
Okay.
More than anything else, but for the purposes of this that's very aspirational. So validating SBOMs is one thing, but then there's a lot of it that's that we're still trying to build the tooling around. So the tooling is the issue there.
Okay. So I colored this to, well, I thought I called, oh, I think I stopped. So in terms of S2C2, if I were to do, like, I know vulnerability remediation, and crud, it's not selecting things for me properly. I feel like these are S2C2F. Am I wrong in that, Jay?
It doesn't speak to it directly, and I get the feeling that these are one of the things that we can work on with it. I think this might be a gap because it doesn't speak to it directly. But when we are scanning for malware, and we're, that should be inventoried correctly, and remediation steps of that should be tracked So I would say yes, because you can't have one without the other.
Okay, so
You know, you can't scan for it, but then not track the remediation of after the fact.
and then I think you said in up here, I think it says to approve open source with the scan manual, deny list, capable, scan first and second, force OSS provenance, proactive security reviews. I feel like it's not, I haven't read the paper, but it almost seems like it's implying that there's some sort of open source approval compliance check process.
No, it definitely is. It definitely isn't implied. I mean, it's I
Okay.
mean, you can't, like I said, you can't have one without the other. You got to be able
Okay.
to say yes or no to it. But the mirroring of repositories and all that kind of stuff. I mean, and by the way, a lot of this stuff is business specific too. So
Yes.
that's all about risk appetite at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
Unless we're
well,
flat out telling organizations you need to do this.
well, SSDF and the White House is telling them if you want to sell to the government, you have to.
True
Right.
that.
That's what most of us are marching towards, is the government says, hey, if you want to do business with us, you need to do this. So guess what? People are going to do it. Okay. Okay, so I think I understand this now. Now, the conversation that you and Isaac were just having, I'm trying to think, is this helpful? Because I know you had that huge diagram, Jay. I was going to call you Jason for some reason. I don't know why. Sorry. This kind of goes into that, who's providing the attestation, right?
Mhm.
What artifacts that they're providing, build versus like a customer, right? Where is the trust lying, right? When it comes to, hey, here's this artifact that says, hey, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. Do you actually trust that artifact? Do you trust that provider? But then I think this down here, this is an example of kind of, what happens in a dev branch, and somebody tries to do a commit and a PR and all the tests that happen. And this looks not quite one-to-one with what you were showing me, because this is more about the testing and the workflow versus yours was more about the actual package and how it's being pulled. So I feel like it's a combination of this and this picture up here. So I'm trying to think, is it useful to show that together somehow in a nice way to build that story of, hey, here's the high level. Now let's walk you through an example of, let's say, S2C2F in action. And then the next step would be, maybe SLSA source and then SLSA build, right? I'm just trying to get a sense of where do we
Wow.
want to go from here?
Geez. Here goes the crazy part about this is, depending on where you sit, and I'm only talking about inside of the SIGs, inside of the working group. Depending upon where each person in the working group sits organizationally and what they work on, they're going to, the appeal will be different. Some are going to want more, some are going to want less. That's hard. That's hard because theoretically, we could try to speak to both of these. I say in the beginning, less is more, but you're going to have a situation where somebody's going to say, well, no, that needs to be spelled out.
Yeah.
I think
And then
the other thing, I mean,
go ahead, Isaac.
No, I was just going to totally agree with you, Jay, that like I think one of the challenges that we've got in OpenSSF is that there's limited overlap in motivation between the parties in the OpenSSF. I think some folks are motivated to to see, their own products get adopted or their own standards get adopted, others to kind of push the state of the industry forward, others are focused on enterprise, others are open source, and so on. And one thing I was going to point at, again, which I think thinking about S2C2F and SLSA is that, SLSA was conceptualized and oriented, or a lot of the activity around SLSA is SLSA adoption and open source right now. And so literally there are people at Google who are tasked with, okay, we want SLSA builds and SLSA provenance for, the top N 100 open source packages, go make that happen. S2C2F, because it's a set of organizational practices, has a different applicability model to open source. Like, is there a world in which, the maintainer of LeftPad is gonna start saying, I have, these organizational practices about how I manage dependencies? It's much harder to see S2C2F being adopted by the open source community, whereas SLSA can be. Whereas looking at these diagrams here, which have an enterprise focus and about enterprise production of software, there's much greater applicability of S2C2F as a set of organizational practices for enterprise. And so again, it's tough because the balance is different where we have our focus. And I think I dare say this is a pattern that I've seen elsewhere in the OpenSSF as well, that there's folks who are thinking all the time about applicability to open source, and there's folks like the end users working group, for example, is chaired by Jonathan, who works for Citi, and his focus is very much on enterprise use cases, and rightly so. And I think that's an important part, but recognizing that there are these two possible areas of focus and areas of applicability, and some frameworks may span both, some may be more appropriate for one than the other, and so on. I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to dash, but this has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I'm so impressed by your mural here, Melba.
Thank you.
Amazing, and it makes me want to go try a mural, to be honest. But also, I'm really heartened and encouraged by just how much agreement we have between the three of us, that I think we can produce something jointly here, which speaks to the complementarity of S2C2F and SLSA, how they're similar, how they're different, how they work together in concert, and also help people understand how you should think about these two in an enterprise context, how you should think about these two in an open source context. I think that they're both they're both targeted towards folks who produce software. But S2C2F around producers who are consumers of upstream dependencies, and SLSA is very much on build. Anyway, with that, I'm going to have to dash. I look forward to much more on this, and I will share some diagrams of my own in the Slack channel.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Isaac. And I guess for Jay, I'm trying to figure out the best way of sharing this. I don't know that I can share this outside without downloading it as a picture.
Which is this? Is this Lucid?
This is Mural.
Mural.
Yeah.
These things are hard, and you have to download it, or you gotta get a trial version, or some type of stuff like that.
No, this is actually it's just a web browser. I don't have anything installed.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, then, I mean, share the link. Then, I mean, I don't know that the whatever the URL is. Hopefully, I can click on the URL and. Well, there's a share button right there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can do it outside of the company. I think that's my problem. I might not be able to send.
Oh, so you have workspace members with visitor link. Oh, anyone with the visitors link. It says no access. Click on that. Click on that one below. Anyone with the visitors link. Click on that no access part. See what it says. View.
Okay.
Well, yeah,
so
I'll
then
only be able to view it. I won't be able
yeah,
to
you won't be able to. Yeah, that's the problem. So, because I know I can I can literally do an export of like either everything or nothing, and I can do like a PDF file. I can do a PNG image. I mean, I
think the exercise that we're doing is rock solid too, because it helps us identify gaps. There are some holes on both ends that we can plug up to like make these things jive.
Yep.
Jive better. They jive well together as is, but I think there's some gaps that we can shore up on both ends, man. I think this is fantastic.
So what I'll do is
I'm so excited about this.
Yeah. I'm downloading this one as a picture because this is kind of the higher level one. This one is already out there, and I don't think we need that one right now. This one you have. This one's also out there. If you want me to redo this, not redo, but re-upload it, that's fine. But this is more of a, hey, from a consumer perspective, when you're getting these attestation, this is what you're getting and who you're getting it from. I don't know that we're there yet. And then this is kind of like that.
This right here, we're working towards it, but we got to get there. I like that though, because that speaks to what I was saying before about what gets created versus what gets created versus what is used for attestation purposes. So how does what gets created gets rolled up into what's being used for attestation?
Yeah. So do you want me to export this as well?
You can.
Okay.
I don't know how. I think right now, I mean, just less is more because we still have more cycles on this between you, Isaac, and I. Right. So we'll be meeting on this more. I mean, if you send it now, I'll probably the next time I look at it, it'll probably be right before our next meeting.
Yeah. I think it's more in case like you will need it for something. I don't know if you're talking to someone or you're like brainstorming and you're like, wait a minute, I wish I had that picture in front of me. This one I didn't go through. I would like to kind of consume that PDF you had a little bit more, because it was hard for me to read on my screen. From I forgot the gentleman's name that created it.
John Meadows.
There you go. I thought it was a John, but I wasn't sure. But let me upload this to upload.
I want to say I shared this in our thread. Where's that thread at? I'm gonna put it in our thread.
Okay, which one?
The John the John Meadows doc.
Oh.
The one that John gave me.
Okay. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna put these two in here. And then just for reference.
I was able to put it in the thread. Oh, you did the same thing. Look at that.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, because that one it was hard to read. And maybe it just is naturally. Maybe it doesn't. The resolution is compressed or something. Let me see. Can I read it now? Yes, I can. Because I was like, what is it saying under like IDE plugins? Okay, I see it now. So okay, cool. I will try to consume this. I will try to see if there's a way of me merging some of the S2CF stuff in here as like modules or something, but I have to take time to read it, and I think that's the gotcha is I need to read it. I've not had the chance. So okay, well, I will let you go because I know we're over on time. Hope you have a good day, and I guess if you need something from me, feel free to ping.
Absolutely, you do the same.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Bye.
All right, thank you, Mel.